Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Blue Lineage podcast. This will be the first episode we get into the timeline of Black American music as listed on the website. Um, as I said before, in this episode, we'll be covering some topics that kind of precede the blues genre and kind of what led into the development and some of the social, uh, historical issues or context that kind of shapes the genre. As you'll notice, um, in these early musicians, W.C. Handy and Mamie Smith, they don't necessarily represent what you might traditionally think of the blues. I kind of covered this last time, but they're important as far as contributors to the blues genre and just the early black music, especially commercially. So just to start off, just to give a little background, I think it's pretty well known that the blues has very strong roots to Africa, specifically West Africa, and some of the traditions and cultural aspects that were brought over to the Americas through the slave trade. Um, Specifically, in reference to the blues, this the African slaves had something called a field holler, and a field holler was essentially sort of a melodic tune or lyrics that an individual would be singing or humming or whatnot as they worked, and it was generally a solo thing, just improvised as they went along, and of course over time it's kind of built up, and eventually that tune or that musical melodic song or series of notes might be passed along to other people, and they might be able to kind of sing along with you or add to it, or kind of talk back. It might just be some kind of like almost conversational in some ways. But the main thing differential is there were also work songs, which work songs were more of a song that had that call and response format that eventually shaped later gospel music. Where someone kind of leads in a phrase and then the audience or the participants call it back, and that's just kind of how you just keep moving through it that way. And that was separate. The field holler was more individualized, and that's why it's a little bit more connected to what the blues became, just because it had that individual and kind of grit and work, blue collar, struggle, and rooted in Africa. Um, Sort of sound, and there are a lot of similarities. However, just similar to a lot of things that kind of predated the 1930s and 40s. There's just a lack of documentation. So obviously the slaves were very limited in what they were able to record, intentionally not educated. And of course, the American culture, white culture, um, at the time, was not necessarily interested in what was going on with black people or the African slaves, or just because, there was outside of, the work side of things, outside of entertainment side of things, what they found entertaining or extracting, there was just not a whole lot of interest there. So everything is a little bit murky early on, and so pe- people, it was a popular notion that field hollers, led into the blues, but it's also very possible that field hollers and blues kind of developed concurrently, and that neither one necessarily preceded each other, because they do have similar structures. And some of the earlier, we know that blues was around the same time, and we know that field hollers, as far as the first recordings, were also around the same time. And so before that, it's kind of unknown. But all this kind of comes together as far as the cultural, the music development that kind of shifted from African slaves and everything that was brought over that way, and started to build a sort of a black American music identity kind of out of that, struggle and hardship, oppression, all of that, and kind of build this into something else. And so that's kind of the foundation of the sound. And then we'll also cover a little bit about some of these cultural phenomena that happened that kind of allowed the music to spread and grow across the U.S. So I think first I'll cover W.C. Handy, a first musician on the timeline, just because he gets into his career, kind of covers a pretty long span and kind of gets into some of the other terminology that we'll talk to on the timeline. Yeah. Okay. So W.C. Handy is an interesting individual because he was a well-trained musician, and he liked to refer to himself as the father of the blues, which is pretty controversial, but also I think also not. It's not heavily disputed, because even W.C. Handy, was somebody who kind of said it, but to some degree knew like that was not maybe the case. But what he did do is he was the first individual to commercially record, to write and compose the song, and to commercially record that song. Blues track, in music history, is the first one to commercially record a blues track. It was called the Memphis Blues. And as I kind of noted briefly in the intro episode, that this sound was not necessarily a sound that you associate with the blues. He had a pretty big backing in ragtime, and some of the other sounds that preceded the blues, as far as like hymns, spirituals, ragtime. He did play jazz later on down the line, which of course ragtime, with blues influences, kind of is what eventually became the jazz. So, he also contributed to that, and it kind of makes sense due to his sound, because he was a well-trained musician. He didn't necessarily ever consider himself, specifically a blues person. He really saw the potential commercial appeal. He, became interested in it, and then, along with some other musicians, tried to record that and, add that into the commercial popular music scene, which eventually did. He did not have the first blues hit, but he's the one who put it out there, put it out to the world commercially. People would hear it and, become a little bit more interested in it, and kind of spread that initial popularity to the commercial music scene. And even though it doesn't sound like a blues track, like when you hear it, you definitely will be like, this, sounds a little bit kind of like ragtime. This is what I keep saying, but I feel like that describes it pretty well, and it fits his other repertoire pretty well, and even more so than some of the other early blues songs that you might hear, just because of his background. But it does follow a 12-bar structure, which is, pretty basic. blues structure. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's a blues track. But the key is like when he recorded it, the blues had already been around. He's not the creator of the blues at all, but it was just not in the spotlight or the focus of the commercial music industry or really pop culture at all. Blues was very much, stemming from former slaves, former or current sharecroppers. A blue collar. It was definitely a very blue collar music, black blue collar music, stemming from the hardships and oppression, and it was really an outlet, and you could really hear that sort of grit, the grind, like people overcoming different struggles and hardships, and the musical portion was definitely a little bit rudimentary and simple in the beginning, very heavily guitar use, because that was one instrument that people were able to get their hands on at the time, and so a lot of early blues was structured on the guitar, which we'll talk about later, and I think I mentioned this before, but the guitar at the time was not really was not a performance instrument. It was an acoustic guitar, especially during those times. It was obviously the sound projection is limited, so you can perform. Remember, this is before you really had a whole lot of amplifying ability. So you really wanted people who could naturally belt, a cappella, I guess you could say, and have instruments that also could project. And the guitar is just not necessarily that type of instrument. An acoustic guitar, if you've been to any kind of concert, usually has some sort of additional a microphone or acoustic electrics. Now you can play and it'll project through a speaker. So at that time, that it's limited. It's kind of a solo instrument, and that's how the blues are kind of crafted. And it was kind of good timing because shortly later, as we'll talk about, electric amplification, electric recording, electric guitar, all this kind of came into play, and that really allowed, some of these blues players to take their song to the next level. But in the meantime, we had these other well-trained musicians like W.C. Handy, who really started off, who could play a bunch of instruments, not necessarily focused on the blues, but was able to hear it. He was a black man. He was going to frequent. He's going to have some ties to black community. He's going to frequent areas that there might be a black establishment, something that white musicians, are probably not less likely to do. I'll say that. And so he had that exposure. I think in the previous episode I mentioned the first time he came upon it, he mentioned that this man was playing, and I didn't specify a location because that's another thing, to come upon a black musician playing the blues. Black people were not able to play in mainstream venues. A lot of bars or places where you would play, especially during those times, it wouldn't be uncommon to see someone playing out in the square or playing maybe in some sort of black establishment. Even the black church, the blues was not it was a outsider music. It was a rebel music. It was not seen as something. It was seen as a genre that was kind of, like I said, a little rough and gritty, but even more so to some people, it was kind of seen as music for low lives. It was a little bit of an underground genre, I guess. Probably one of the original American underground genres, actually. And so you're not going to necessarily see this in places you frequent, in other words. But as a black man, you're going to have a higher occurrence of encountering another black musician, just because you got everything segregated. You're very limited into where you can go and where you can perform, what you can do. And so that was, I think one of the reasons that W.C. Handy was able to be exposed to that and add that to his music repertoire and bring that to the commercial um, recording industry. Um, so a little bit more about W.C. Handy's career. He did some teaching. He was like a well-trained musician, band leader, and one thing about W.C. Handy is, as he was going through his career before he did this recording, he did perform in the minstrel shows, which is pretty controversial. But that was one of the ways that he was able to kind of gain some success and get to this point where he was able to kind of put together bands and record commercially early on, when a lot of black musicians weren't able to. And if in case you're not familiar, minstrel shows are well known mostly well known for the blackface performances that occurred. And it was initially really white performers and performing in blackface, and basically just it basically just mimicking black people in not good ways, I think, is the most brief summary I can give. But for more background, the first famous character was Thomas D. Rice, his character was known as Jim Crow, and of course during those times it started during slavery, but post-slavery, the Jim Crow laws took over the South and kind of became a post-slavery enslavement, really limiting what black people were able to do, and essentially setting very low threshold for black people to be incarcerated and then therefore being put to work again. That's very brief summary. Definitely look more into it. But I'm trying to focus a little bit more on the timeline vocab. So minstrel shows, like I said, started off with mostly white performance in blackface. Eventually, black performers would also join in, because it really was the only way for black entertainers to gain a living at that time. And also, you have to remember that in general, the type of work options for black people were limited. So when something opened, it, even if it seemed like a position where you are forfeiting some dignity, maybe not representing your culture as you would want to. Those were opportunities that were hard to come by, and there were other positions I think that some people might view differently as losing dignity. They saw this as an opening or an opportunity to do something that they liked. Maybe it was not as difficult as some other positions. In W.C. Handy's case, obviously he was a trained musician, and so he felt in his position that either I'm going to continue as a black musician, being well trained and probably never reach any sort of commercial success or really be able to become profitable or successful financially in my industry, just because at some point, someone is going to have to rise above and break through. And I think, at least in W.C. Handy's perspective, this was the best route to do it, and he was the one, he had an opportunity to do that. So I think it's definitely controversial. I don't know. It's hard to say, is it worth it or is it not worth it? Because, especially if you look into minstrel shows, it's pretty, they're pretty, there's a lot of the stereotypes that are still used today, black stereotypes that are still used today, were developed during those times, but very exaggerated. And, even if they weren't true, I think some of those were thrown out to the American culture so heavily and so intensely that they kind of stuck. And so, take that for what it is. But it's not, it's interesting, but very kind of startling. I think if once you really get into it, especially the imagery and some of the music and songs that were performed at the time. I don't know if you've ever seen Bamboozled by Spike Lee. I think that's like a really good summary of what the essence of what minstrel shows were. Even though it's not really a period piece, but it is, essentially it is about minstrel shows and kind of that sacrifice. And it does address the sacrifice because they're black performers and kind of, I mean, it really is contrasting that time to the modern industry and like how far we come in a lot of ways. I think is the essence of the movie, but it does kind of also put out that dilemma that I think W.C. Handy was facing, which is, for some people it was worthwhile to make that kind of sacrifice, I guess, to forward, move people forward and hopefully the next generation does not have to do this type of performance. But minstrel shows were actually the first purely American form of theater, followed by vaudeville. I actually don't know if vaudeville is purely American. I think is it? But I know minstrel shows were. And I know vaudeville came next. That'll have to be something that gets looked up, or perhaps someone can add that note in comments, or let me know. But yeah, there's all different kind of skits, different kind of performance. It was kind of circusy, I think. Personally, just because everything was so exaggerated, but it was very popular, especially in the 1840s. It really didn't get that much criticism until it kind of faded into the 20th century. I know Frederick Douglass was one of the few people to really come out and say, this is not okay, and just to note how absurd and crazy all this kind of was. But there's a little bit of information on the website on minstrel shows. I think that kind of covers it. I think a lot of it was just relevant because of W.C. Handy, and that's kind of how he got his start. That's also how Bessie Smith, who I don't cover in the timeline, but is a major blues figure, and she also had gotten her start in minstrel shows. There's quite a few individuals who got their start in minstrel shows / vaudeville, and even in vaudeville there were still some minstrel-like performances, blackface performances, and it's an interesting time period to look at, because if you go through it, like there's you'll see magazine covers like Ebony, Jet, the other black media at the time, popular magazine type media, and you go through it through the years, and it's interesting how it was portrayed, because it wasn't really heavily frowned upon per se, or even criticized as, I guess, heavily racist. Like, not even in comparison. People definitely recognize it, but when you look at the content and you look at the criticism, even into the later stages, and especially, it's kind of surprising coming from some of the black media outlets. It was kind of, I guess, accepted as kind of a stain on America's past entertainment industry, but it wasn't heavily criticized. So I mean, I won't dwell on it too much, but it is a bit interesting, and it really did not fully disappear until I think you can find some performances, maybe not in blackface, but still it's still a minstrel show, and I think the characters are still representative. But I think they've noted them into the 1970s. I don't know about 1980s, but something to look into if this is interesting for whatever reason. Um, and another part of that, just to continue on, I guess, and cover some things while we're here, is to talk about the Great Migration. And this is something that will actually start now, in these early periods. It started in 1910, and it really continued into the 1970s. So it'll be a topic that comes up again, and because it's actually sometimes split into two sections. The first migration was between 1910 and 1940, and it basically kind of slowed during the Great Depression and for other reasons, and then it kind of picked up again in the 1940 later 1940s, and continued into 1970. So I guess realistically, the decline would have been in the 1930s and 40s, but then the increase happened in the 1940s and continued into the 1970s, to try to clarify. But basically, what that was it was just after the Civil War. There was that Reconstruction era or period, and during that period, most Black Americans lived in the South. 90% lived in the rural South. And, after the Civil War in the South, slavery was over. The ability to continue the economic structure in the South without slavery, and there was obviously going to have to be some major changes, and that's one reason that Jim Crow, of course, came along. Jim Crow laws came along and tried to, I guess, in a lot of ways, preserve that. But regardless, there was going to be some major changes, just because there was, slave labor, is going from slave labor to some sort of paid or alternative compensation, is like sharecropping and whatnot, is, even if some of those are not situations or professions, when I look for labor that is adequately paid for, it's more than free. Is basically what you're getting at. So yeah, there conflicts rose up. People are trying to get rights. There's this a lot of stuff was starting to stir up, and coming into the 1900s, there was a lot of anti-Black violence, whether it was through the KKK or other anti-Black groups or people. And so, in addition to that, also just the need to get new types of work, labor, move forward economically. A lot of Black Americans also moved north for that reason, but the whole migration was a shift from the rural South to the northern states and urban areas, for those reasons. And by let me see, I think I have some stats for this. It's also on the website. Should be on the website, the description that I'm going off of right now. So by 1970, 50% of the Black population now lived in the northern states, and 80% of those individuals lived in urban areas. So there's a big shift from 90% in the South, rural, to 80% in urban areas in the North. So I think that's actually a social switch that not that many people actually go through, now that I think about it. But if you can imagine, living in a farm area your entire life and now living in an urban area for you know, the rest of your life, and as your family continues to develop in that area. That's a really big shift, and you can kind of see how all of a sudden you have these musicians who blues guys who are playing in rural sort of settings, develop this kind of rural music coming from a blue collar situation, hardship, post slavery. What the oppression through slavery, oppression through post slavery, everything that's going along around that, racial persecution, and kind of bringing that whole a genre that was kind of built on that and bringing that into an urban setting, and then all of a sudden this rural sort of crafted blues now is seen as an urban genre, because that's when it really took off, is when is during the Great Migration, as people moved to some of these urban cities. That's where a lot of the people that you're probably more familiar with, and W.C. Handy or Mamie Smith, that's when a lot of those individuals, as we got deeper into the migration, that's when a lot of those individuals started to surface, and we saw recordings. And it also coincided with, like I said, electrical recording technology, a lot of these technologies that really allowed many people to be exposed to these new types of music that were before kind of closed off in the South and rural areas. Rural areas, not a whole lot of exposure. It was kind of like, it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways, because it was isolated in rural areas and it was produced on plantations and these sharecrop lands and just general rural areas, it was kind of created in almost not in a vacuum, but I think the black culture that was dominated the South, dominated the rural South, was isolated, and they were able to kind of craft something of their own without outside influences. And I think that's pretty rare as far as when you look at modern music. I think you can argue that country definitely was that way. I'm not a country expert, but from what I know, I think country was kind of put together in a similar fashion. But that sort of being made in a vacuum and then kind of being moved into this other area, and then really, I think, preserving its roots, but in a lot of ways exploding, and a lot of influences added into it through technology and some of the innovations that were going on at the time. And of course, just the cultural shifts from going to rural to urban areas, especially during those times. I think it's interesting. It's very interesting, and I think that essence of the blues kind of continues. That sort of that grit, the oppression, the core, overcoming all these obstacles, bringing one culture here and sort of adapting that culture to a new area, despite all the hardships. Maintaining, it still contains some traditions from Africa. It still contains, a lot of the oral tradition and some of the musical structure to some degree. I think that sort of, I don't want to say it, I guess blueprint, that sort of core essence of the blues is what makes up the blue lineage, and how that goes from, because from this point on, you're really looking at, as far as the black music genres, you're looking at a lot of stuff that was created in urban centers, but I think when you really look at each of these genres, there's something different stands out in comparison to other modern music, something that kind of just has that blues energy, that like I was saying, that grit, just a lot of, I don't want to say soul, because I feel like soul is there is soul, but I don't want to. I'm sure when people say soul, it has a soul of the blues, they know they'd know what I mean, but I kind of want to break it down further to um, than to just say that. But that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that essence. It kind of starts in the blues, from that situation, comes to an urban area, and that essence kind of carries on within each genre of the following genres. Despite them being made in an urban area, there's sort of that that something extra, that uniqueness. Um, but I think that'll we'll come back to that, and they'll materialize down the road. Because right now, with the music as we're talking about it at the moment, W.C. Handy and the next individual, Mommy Smith, or Mamie Smith. I've honestly only read her name. I've never heard it pronounced out loud. I've just read it over time, so I don't actually know if it's Mommy or Mammy. I guess I've gone with Mommy since I've said it so many times already. Um, but yeah, their music is a little bit different because it was trying to push a genre that I don't think they even had a full hold on um, into the commercial scene, because they saw it as something that could be successful, or the writers um, thought it as something that could be successful commercially. It was new. It was interesting. It brought a different sort of flavor to what was music at this point. I think a lot of people saw that potential, and not necessarily what the potential that was people embraced later on, but just the new sound kind of potential, and what that brought to the scene, I think, is primarily what people were trying to capitalize on at the time. With that said, though, I will say that Mommy Smith and Perry Bradford is the one who wrote Crazy Blues. The Crazy Blues was the first blues commercial hit ever, and Mommy Smith was the singer. Perry Bradford was the writer, and Perry Bradford at through that track and the other tracks they recorded, he was the first black manager to put together a all black band and to record a record. So they were kind of doing two things that hadn't been done at the time. Well, the record recording was one, and then of course it took a while for Crazy Blues to actually become a hit, but Crazy Blues was a hit, and they were recording at that time. So it was kind of two landmark, I guess, events happening there. And this was in 1920. So once again, at this point, there are other musicians who are performing. At that point, Ma Rainey was performing, who I think most people would consider her to be a more traditional blues singer. And Bessie Smith was also out there. Trying to think of, those are definitely by far the most popular individuals at the time. But for Mommy Smith, she was the first to record this hit. It sold 790,000 copies in the first year, which is definitely a lot more than anyone else at the time had sold as far as the blues. I'm not honestly sure what they considered to be a hit at the time, what kind of threshold you had to cross during those days, but nonetheless, it was considered the first blues hit, and it has a lot more, it still has a sort of ragtime, and especially because Mommy had a vaudeville background, it had a sort of kind of theatrical, I guess, sound to it also, just her vocal stylings. You can hear that in the music too, if you listen to it. But I think what also made it a little bit more of a blues song is that Perry Bradford, who wrote it, was a little bit more, he was a little bit more in touch, I guess, with what was going on with the black community and some of the race issues political issues that were going on at the time. The song was recorded in 1920, early 1920, and in 1919, as part of this migration, we had all these individuals moving from the south to the north urban cities, and what was happening is there was there were conflicts um, with black and white people starting to interact, and people were felt that there were jobs were being taken. Um, you know, there was obviously already racial tension. In the North, it wasn't as formalized as in the South, where you have Jim Crow laws. So I think, um, the riots, protests in the South looked much differently than in the North. I think in the North, it was kind of like, people felt, especially black people felt that there was hope. There was a level of rights because black people had already successfully been working in the North to this point, and it felt like there was pushback because of white people felt at the time there was some scarcity. People are taking jobs, and just overall, of course, there was just racist philosophies in general about intermingling and mixing and people sharing spaces. And obviously, with all these people moving to the city, it was, the city landscape was changing dramatically. Long story short, there was a lot of riots in 1919. They referred, it was from, I think, the winter, from that winter into the fall. Basically was a lot of unrest, a lot of riots. That 1919 summer is referred to as a Red Summer, specifically in Chicago and Washington, D.C., is where the most severe clashes took place. That's where black people really fought back, and there was some major clashes in those areas. Once again, something to look into. I want to touch on these social and historical events just to give context, but I want to try to focus on the music as much as possible. I just think some of this stuff is real important as far as shaping what was going on, shaping the music, shaping how the music was constructed, how people were able to navigate the recording industry, and just how their personal life might be impacting their musical decisions, or how they're performing, where they're performing, and the commercial success. And the Crazy Blues is a good example, just because there were elements. It's not clear. I don't think how conscious this was in Perry Bradford's mind when he wrote it, but there are elements in the song that were seen as rebellious. Some people call it militant. I'm not sure if I would put it that far. Actually, I can. I'll let you decide to see if how militant he is, just from this excerpt. Specifically in the Crazy Blues, people refer to a line that goes like, it says, "Get myself a gun and shoot myself a cop. I ain't had nothing but bad news. Now I've got the crazy blues." And this was also part of a commentary where they did talk about Perry Bradford as a sort of a black militant at the time, in a excerpt that was about Mamie Smith in A New Literary History of America. But just from hearing that, I think it's a little bit of a stretch, especially as an artist. But with that said, at that time, this is 1920. You have limited examples of black artists who have that sort of position, that a position where they are able to commercially record and put that content out to the greater public. You don't really hear many examples of even something like that being put out there and being recorded and recorded and sold or played or whatever for the American people. So that portion and just um, and there were a few other examples that really uh, created sort of a stir that led to, especially people in the black community, hearing someone speak out and something that they related to. There was other songs that kind of touched on some black issues that were going on. So hearing something like that coming from the commercial side of music definitely led to more black people buying the record than you would normally see someone buy a commercial record, which was big because at that time record players were just kind of being sold commercially. So, and actually at that time, being new technology, you had black people and anyone who was in that sort of class. You'd probably be looking at a lower middle class to middle class and under at the time. There are very, very few upper class black Americans at that time, comparatively. So a lot of people were taking out, installment payments. Now we take installment payments out for a car. At the time, people were taking installments out for their record player, and so people were doing that just to get their hands on music like this. And then, of course, on the other side, this the blues sound and the flow. There was a general interest, I think, growing in the overall mainstream community, a general interest, increasing interest in the blues, and so that kind of is what propelled, the other side of the song gaining commercial success. Now, outside of that, that's like the main contribution or main. That's the main reason that Mamie Smith was included in this timeline, because of that kind of first. Also Perry Bradford and his contribution to making the song a hit in the black community. Also, because the rest, Mamie Smith overall did not really have a whole lot of commercial success in the blues genre, or just in the music genre, commercial music genre in general. Like I said earlier, she was a vaudeville performer initially, and that is a career that she continued to pursue before and after her recording career. This album was a hit, but that was her big notoriety was for this and her performance. Her vocally, she wasn't necessarily what people considered a fit for the blues music genre. Just kind of, when you listen to her and you listen to like a Ma Rainey, there's definitely a contrast there, and I think you hear Ma Rainey and she definitely fits what you would think of as a blues singer a little bit more than Mamie Smith. But nonetheless, there was success here, but she continued to perform. That's where she gained the rest of her success, and she was interesting, I guess. So an interesting note about Mamie Smith being a vaudeville performer is, as I had mentioned when I was talking about minstrel shows and vaudeville kind of following that and continuing that sort of minstrel skits or aspects of minstrel shows, and that whole essence in vaudeville still, vaudeville didn't necessarily, outside of those minstrel performances, did not necessarily mock black culture in that same way, but there was still a huge inequality and a huge unfair treatment of black actors versus white actors, just as far as the design and production of the show. Because a lot of the inspiration for a lot of the performances and dancing, um, a lot of that came from black culture. Some of the writers or the actresses would work alongside these black actors and um, learn different you know different singing styles, different dancing styles, and they would kind of use that in their performances and also take inspiration from just black cultural events as they saw it and kind of write it in a way that they want to portray them. And so just basically a lot of I guess unfair borrowing, unfair use um, of just black culture was um, heavily occurred in vaudeville. And Mommy Smith was somebody who was in a movement that was occurring at the time where black actors had gained a decent amount of success, enough success that some people were able to sort of uh, kind of divert or create their own black kind of vaudeville scene where you had black writers, black producers making black productions, performances that reflected black culture as they felt it should be, kind of restoring some of the tradition, some of the dances that they felt were stolen or misused in other previously in vaudeville. And Mommy Smith was kind of involved with that, so it was kind of appropriate for her to be this voice on this track that kind of created some political stir, talking about Crazy Blues again, because that she in her own right in the theater sector, she was really part of something that was political and shaping black theater careers, and now she was impacting black music, black commercial music. And so even though she comes from a theater background, I think that kind of makes it appropriate for her to have recorded this track. But so yeah, interesting stuff. She is an interesting early performer. I'm not really an expert in black performance theater myself. I mostly just know of her from her music performances and her early contribution to black American music. So that is Mommy Smith. So that covers the individuals I wanted to speak about on the website. They have bios, both W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith, that are much more condensed. I wanted just to elaborate a little bit more on both of them, and the whole idea is to really show how their lives, a little bit about their lives, personal lives, and how it shaped their musical career, but also how the social and historical context shaped how they were able to perform what they performed, how it may have impacted their writing and the overall structure of the black music industry at the time. They're just very key examples. There are other performers at that time who were playing the blues, but these are firsts. And early in the timeline, I wanted to feature some of these early individuals because they're not necessarily people that we've heard about, even if if you're pretty well versed in some of the earlier blues artists. They're not necessarily someone you hear about. And then on top of that, you have someone like W.C. Handy. So you have someone like W.C. Handy who maybe you've heard as the father of the blues, but now that you are able to find out a little bit more about it, you can find that it's a little bit more complex than that. Let me just see if there is any more terminology that we should cover before moving on to end this episode. But thanks for hanging in there. I know this is a little bit more dense, and the topics are not exactly positive, but that's the essence of the blues. It came from a dark place, but as many blues players will tell you, even though the content, the lyrics of the blues might be sad or negative, it might reflect struggle. The blues is what makes them happy, and I think that's what makes the listeners happy. Is that the music is it offers a sort of a sense of relief and overcoming a struggle. Even though if you probably read blues, if you only read blues lyrics every day, I see how that could be depressing. But when you put it all together, I think that's kind of the essence of the blues and that's what I'm trying to get at is that it came from a dark place, but of course there are great West African traditions that were brought along. There's great triumph and people overcoming very extreme hardship to get to a point where they're able to kind of create art again, perform that art, even if it's for a small audience. I think people can relate to just that ability to have that artistic freedom, and then express it to whatever audience and kind of pass it along. I feel like that is fulfilling, and I think that just to touch on a couple more terminology items before I end this episode. There was a couple things on the timeline. There is Tin Pan Alley. Did not touch on that. And Tin Pan Alley was basically just an area of New York, areas of New York actually, because they shifted to different blocks over a period of time. But Tin Pan Alley, generally speaking, if you want to read about it a little bit more on their website, there's not a huge description there either. But generally speaking, it was an area where publishers would buy music from songwriters so they could produce sheet music from that and sell it. And it was really just, I guess, a glaring example of just where the music industry was and where it was headed. Just from a production standpoint, the reason it was a very large collection of publishers, and you just had a lot of songwriters and people coming through just trying to kind of produce whatever they can and sell it. It was not necessarily for quality, and so when people would refer to Tin Pan Alley later, you may or may have not heard of Tin Pan Alley. It's definitely mentioned in songs down the road, especially in the 50s and 60s. When people refer to Tin Pan Alley in hindsight, usually they're just talking about someone who is trying to sell music more so for profit than quality, is what that is. Let me see if there's anything else. Race record. So race records were the first name for the genre of what was down the road known as R&B, later to be known as R&B and hip hop. All of those genres, that it's basically the same genre that has existed throughout music history. It's just taken on many names. And race record or race music was the first label, and that started in the 1920s. Mamie Smith would have been the first race record hit, and W.C. Handy and everyone else who recorded at that time would have been called a race record. It's a black black musician recording that's intended for a black audience, more or less. So basically encapsulated blues, gospel, R&B eventually, and basically all the genres that are on this timeline. Jazz may or may not, depend on the record and the record company, because it's not, the music industry is not necessarily just in one business called the music industry. It's a series of producers, recording labels, and then you have the people who put the content out, play the content, radios, performers, and so depending on what label it was, but who was recording it, it might be categorized differently. Of course, there's Billboard. I think Billboard used a race record up till 1940 or so, and then really that became, everything basically shifted to R&B or something of that nature. From that point on, it was R&B and hip hop. For a while, there was hot black something for the Billboard charts, hot black hits or something. I have I'll put something out at some point more about it, because I think it is interesting, because I think it's interesting how the label changed because like race music was no longer seen as socially acceptable. Not necessarily because new genres of music were being invented. A lot of R&B already really existed by the time they shifted race records to R&B, and it kind of continued that way through until they changed it again. But in the meantime, you had other genres being invented, and they were just kind of being thrown under this label, which was no longer called race records. But when you think about it, essentially all black music is just being categorized in this same label still. So it's almost just it's almost semantics to some degree, and I find it interesting because it's kind of the same way today. So it's something to discuss further, maybe another time, because we're early on, and more race records are going to be released at this point. Another note for the terminology that I didn't cover that is posted in relation to this episode is songsters, which is not on the timeline. Songsters are just good to know, because songsters are musicians who were they're basically the first independent music acts before blues musicians were known as blues musicians. So we're still talking about when people were in the rural areas mostly. There were songsters who were white and black. Charlie Patton, who we'll talk about later on, is probably the most well-known songster to blues musician. So songsters kind of embodied a much wider music repertoire. However, blues musicians would travel among these individuals, with these individuals, and perform songs, on the road. And as black Americans shifted towards urban areas, a lot of those individuals became known as blues musicians, as that genre evolved into the blues. And some songsters actually either shifted more into ragtime. Some of them went towards more of a country vibe. It was just because songsters was kind of an eclectic collection of people who, a lot of them played guitar actually, and some of those individual smaller acts where you're dependent on either a few instruments essentially. I think that covers it though. Thanks for tuning in to this first episode. Hopefully things continue to develop a little bit more smoothly. But thanks for hanging in there with me. As we move through, there's not really a set amount of time on the timeline that I'm going to cover. I think usually before each episode, or after, I guess at the end of the previous episode, I will elaborate a little bit. Um, I'll talk about what I believe I'll be covering in the next episode. Um, in this case, we will likely cover the invention of electrical recording technology, along with Blind Willie Johnson, Charlie Patton, who I just mentioned, and Jack L. Cooper. We'll probably also cover the Shetland circuit at that time and likely the first commercial electric guitar. And that'll kind of get us through a lot of the culture and historical context that kind of dominates the early part of the timeline, setting the stage for the following genres, following artists. Because after that, as you can see, it gets a little bit more musician dense, which might be a little bit more interesting if you're here for that part. I enjoy both. I think diving into some of the events and historical context that led up to all of this is really interesting and something that really can become a discussion at another point. And yeah. So thanks for listening. Tune in next time. At this point, the next episode should come out within a week. After that, it looks like the episodes will be shifting to bi-weekly, but don't hold me to that yet. Everything is kind of just being developed right now, but I'll keep you all updated. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, blue_lineage, and Twitter, Blue Lineage. There's not a whole lot to see on social media yet, but that will be the place to look to keep updated about any announcements or new articles, or if you want to interact with me and the community, maybe suggestions, maybe some comments, maybe trying to add some supplementary information, materials. I think part of this is about sort of building on that oral tradition. There are many communities that cover these genres individually. There are many communities that cover some of these artists individually. There's regional sort of Black American music or Black music sort of historical, I guess not projects, but just sites or organizations, I guess you can say. But I think the idea is, at least in this context, to kind of bring a lot of that together. And I think part of that is sort of kind of reviving some things that were really passed on orally within families, and some of the older generation I think still has a lot of the stories that are not yet written down, especially for some of these older events and older artists that were not really well recorded. I think some of those stories are still out there, but also some of it is just in these regional and more local organizations and communities that have developed, and that it's not something that the greater world is necessarily aware of. So I'm always open to getting more information about the stuff, adding that to our social media, adding that to episodes later. I'm really open as far as all that goes. I just want to make sure that kind of stuff gets out there, and that we build out this blue lineage, and really, I think, create a very well laid out lineage or timeline of Black American music as it applies to blues, R&B, funk, and hip hop. And that is the mission, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for listening. Tune in soon. Like I said, the next episode should be up within a week. Bye for now.